A racist police officer humiliated and pointed a gun at an FBI agent, and the result? He ended up in prison. This shocking story not only exposed blatant abuse of power, but also showcased the strength of standing firm against injustice. The officer had no idea that the woman he threatened was a seasoned FBI agent, and every move he made was being recorded as evidence that would seal his fate. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment of injustice like this? How would you respond if it happened to you? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to share where you're watching from. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. The afternoon was quiet in Riverside Heights, an exclusive neighborhood where sprawling mansions hid behind rows of towering oaks. Everything about the area radiated affluence and serenity, from the neatly trimmed hedges to the expensive cars parked in wide driveways. Yet, for Maya Carter, a newly relocated FBI agent, there was an undercurrent of tension she couldn't shake. Maya, a black woman in her early 40s, had moved here just a week ago. She wasn't the type to feel out of place. Her career had taught her how to navigate hostile environments and disarm tense situations. But as she jogged along the pristine sidewalks, dressed in her usual workout gear, she couldn't ignore the subtle prickle of unease. Halfway through her run, Maya noticed it, a black SUV moving slowly behind her. It wasn't uncommon to see vehicles cruising through the neighborhood, but this car stayed close, matching her pace as she rounded a corner. Its tinted windows made it impossible to see who was inside. Maya adjusted her speed, testing to see if the car would do the same. It did. Her pulse quickened, not from the exertion, but from the unmistakable sense of being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, trying to appear casual, but the SUV came to a sudden stop. She turned her eyes forward, keeping her pace steady, and mentally cataloged details. Make, model, partial license plate. Years of training had made this instinctive. Despite the unease, Maya told herself to remain calm. Maybe it was just paranoia. She took a deep breath, forcing her mind to focus on the rhythm of her feet hitting the pavement and the gentle rustle of leaves overhead. Yet her gut told her otherwise. The feeling wasn't new. Before leaving for her jog, she had discovered an envelope slipped under her door. The note inside was simple, just one line typed in bold letters. "Don't think everyone here will welcome you." Maya had stared at the message for a long moment, her FBI instincts kicking in. It was vague, perhaps meant to unsettle her, but not overtly threatening. Still, the implication was clear. Someone in Riverside Heights didn't want her there. She had shrugged it off, tucking the note into her desk drawer. This wasn't the first time she'd encountered hostility in her life, and it wouldn't be the last. If anything, it motivated her to lace up her sneakers and go for a run to clear her head. Now, with the SUV looming behind her and the note fresh in her mind, Maya couldn't help but feel the pieces connecting. Whoever was in that car wanted her to know she was being watched. As she approached the end of the block, the SUV suddenly revved its engine and sped off, disappearing around the next corner. Maya slowed her pace, her instincts on high alert. She stopped at the edge of a manicured lawn, pretending to stretch while scanning the street. It was empty. For now, her phone buzzed in the small pocket of her leggings. She pulled it out to find a text from a colleague at the bureau. "Settling in okay?" it read. Maya hesitated, then typed back, "Still adjusting? It's different here." Different was putting it mildly. Riverside Heights, for all its outward charm, had an edge of exclusivity that didn't welcome outsiders easily. Being one of the few black residents, and a federal agent no less, made Maya stick out even more. Pocketing her phone, she resumed her run, keeping her steps light and her senses sharp. She made a mental note to check her security cameras when she got home. Maybe the SUV or its driver had passed by her house earlier. As she rounded the corner onto another quiet street, she spotted a pair of joggers ahead, a man and a woman, both in their 30s, chatting animatedly as they ran. They glanced at her briefly, but didn't smile or nod in acknowledgement. Instead, their conversation faltered, and they exchanged a look before continuing. Maya pretended not to notice. The note, the SUV, the cold stares. It was all building to something. Maya could feel it. She passed by a small park, the sound of children playing, offering a brief moment of normalcy. But even then, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was watching her every move. As Maya approached her street, her thoughts turned to her training. Her job had taught her to be vigilant, to anticipate threats before they materialized. But this situation was different. This wasn't a hostile criminal or a volatile informant. This was her neighborhood, her supposed safe space. Reaching her driveway, she paused, looking around one last time. Everything seemed calm, but the quiet felt unnaturally heavy. She walked up to her front door and let herself in, the lock clicking loudly behind her. She didn't know what Riverside Heights had in store for her, but one thing was clear. This wasn't going to be a peaceful transition. The sound of tires screeching jolted Maya from her focus. A sharp, piercing siren followed, cutting through the quiet of the empty street. She slowed her jog, turning her head in time to see a police car veer sharply into her path and come to a halt, blocking the sidewalk. A white man in his mid-40s, his police badge glinting in the sunlight, stepped out of the car. His expression was hard, eyes narrowed with suspicion. Maya instinctively slowed to a stop, her body tense. "Excuse me," he barked, his tone sharp and demanding. "What are you doing here?" Maya's mind worked quickly. This wasn't an ordinary inquiry. It was accusatory, as if she'd been caught committing a crime. She stood upright, wiping the light sheen of sweat from her brow. "Just jogging," she said evenly. "I live around the corner." Blake's frown deepened. He scanned her from head to toe, his gaze lingering as if searching for something incriminating. "Jogging?" he repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. "I've never seen you around here before. Which house is yours?" Maya bristled, but forced herself to stay calm. "Maple Street," she replied, her voice steady. "A few blocks that way." "Maple Street," Blake echoed, crossing his arms. "You expect me to believe that? This isn't exactly the kind of neighborhood where people just wander through. Prove it." "Which house?" Maya's jaw tightened. "I don't carry my house deed when I go for a jog," she replied, her tone clipped but controlled. "But I live here." Blake's hand drifted to his belt, resting deliberately close to his holstered firearm. The gesture wasn't lost on Maya. "Look," he said coldly, stepping closer. "I'm in charge of keeping this neighborhood safe, and right now, you're looking a little out of place." "I don't need to prove anything to you," Maya said, her voice firmer now. "I have every right to jog in my own neighborhood." Blake's eyes hardened, his fingers brushing the grip of his gun in a way that made the threat unmistakable. "Listen, lady," he snapped, his voice lowering to a growl. "You can either cooperate or we can do this the hard way." Maya's heart pounded, but she didn't let it show. Years of FBI training had prepared her for confrontations, but this felt different, more personal. "Officer," she began, choosing her words carefully, "I understand you're doing your job, but you're crossing a line. I suggest you step back." Blake's laugh was humorless, almost mocking. "You don't get to suggest anything. Now step over here." He gestured sharply toward the hood of his car. Maya didn't move. "I'm not doing anything illegal," she said. Blake took 2 quick steps forward, closing the gap between them. Without warning, he grabbed her arm and yanked her toward the car. The force of it made her stumble, her hip colliding with the cold metal of the hood. "Hey," Maya protested, twisting her arm free with a sharp motion. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Blake's grip tightened momentarily before he released her, his expression a mix of anger and disdain. "Don't resist," he snapped. "I need to make sure you're not carrying anything you shouldn't be." Maya straightened, her adrenaline surging. She took a deep breath, her gaze locked on him. "Let go of me," she said, her voice steady but laced with warning. Blake sneered. "You're awfully bold for someone who doesn't belong here." "I told you I live here," Maya shot back, her tone sharper now. "And unless you have a valid reason to detain me, this conversation is over." Blake didn't budge. Instead, he leaned closer, his face inches from hers. "You think you can talk to me like that?" he hissed. "Do you know who I am?" Maya met his glare head on. "Do you know who I am?" she countered. "Because you're making a mistake you won't be able to walk away from." For a moment, there was silence. The air between them crackled with tension. Blake's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but his bravado didn't waver. "You're gonna regret that," he muttered, stepping back. Maya adjusted her stance, subtly angling herself away from him. Her fingers brushed the edge of her workout top, activating the hidden camera clipped to her clothing. If this encounter escalated further, she wanted every second documented. Blake took a step back, but his hand remained near his gun. "One last chance," he said. "Cooperate, or you'll find out just how hard we can make things for you." Maya's blood boiled, but she kept her tone calm. "You're out of line, officer. And if you don't stop, you'll find yourself explaining this to someone higher up." Blake smirked. "We'll see about that." Before either of them could say more, the distant sound of children's laughter broke through the tension, momentarily grounding Maya. Blake glanced toward the noise, then back at her. "You're lucky this time," he muttered, stepping away. "But don't think this is over." Maya didn't move until he turned and climbed back into his car. She watched as he slammed the door and drove off, the siren wailing briefly as he sped away. Her hands were shaking, but she forced herself to take a steadying breath. She looked around, scanning the street for witnesses, but the few faces she saw quickly disappeared behind curtains and shutters. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or an isolated incident. Maya could feel it in her bones. This was the beginning of something much bigger, and she wasn't about to back down. The tension between Maya and Officer Blake was far from diffused. Blake, his expression dark and his posture rigid, gestured sharply toward the curb. "Sit down," he commanded, his voice hard. "You're not going anywhere until I'm done here." Maya didn't move. "I'm not sitting," she replied firmly, crossing her arms. "You have no grounds to detain me. If you have a reason to stop me, state it now. Otherwise, this is harassment." Blake's lips curled into a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Harassment? You're in no position to lecture me, lady. Now sit your ass down before I make you." Maya met his gaze without flinching. "You're abusing your authority, officer. This stops now." Her calm but unyielding response seemed to infuriate him further. Without warning, he lunged forward and grabbed the strap of her small running backpack. "Let's see what you're hiding in here," he muttered, yanking it off her shoulder. "Hey!" Maya protested, stepping back instinctively. "You can't just take my bag." Blake ignored her, unzipping the pack and rifling through it with deliberate force. "Why so defensive, huh? Got something you shouldn't have?" He dumped her water bottle, keys, and phone onto the sidewalk, the items clattering loudly. "That's enough!" Maya's voice was sharp, carrying the weight of authority. "You're violating my rights. Put the bag down." Blake threw the empty backpack on the ground, his smirk returning. "You've got a lot of nerve talking to me like that," he said, stepping closer, his body language openly confrontational. "People like you don't just walk around this neighborhood without raising questions." "People like me?" Maya's tone was ice cold. "Care to clarify what you mean by that?" Blake's smirk faltered, but only for a second. "Don't play dumb," he snapped. "You don't belong here, and we both know it. If you want to make this easy on yourself, cooperate. Otherwise, things might get complicated." Maya didn't back down. "Is that a threat?" Blake took another step forward, his chest puffed out as if trying to physically intimidate her. His voice dropped, low and menacing. "Call it whatever you want. Just know that I decide who gets to stay comfortable around here." The exchange was loud enough to draw attention. A few neighbors peeked out from their windows or stood at their doorsteps, watching the confrontation unfold. None of them intervened. Maya scanned the small crowd out of the corner of her eye, searching for even a glimmer of support. All she found were averted gazes and indifferent expressions. "You see?" Blake said, gesturing vaguely toward the spectators. "Nobody's gonna stand up for you. You're alone in this." Maya's fists clenched at her sides. She wanted to fire back, to remind him that he was out of line, but she knew escalating her tone wouldn't help. Instead, she spoke slowly, her voice steady and measured. "You've crossed a line, officer. Your behavior isn't just inappropriate, it's illegal. Keep this up, and you'll answer for it." Blake laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Answer to who? You?" He leaned closer, his face inches from hers. "Let me tell you something, lady. Around here, I make the rules." Maya refused to be intimidated. "And I follow the law, the real law. What you're doing right now is textbook misconduct. You think this ends with me standing here? It doesn't." The words seemed to hit a nerve. Blake's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he growled. His hand dropped to the holster on his belt, resting deliberately on the grip of his gun. The message was clear. Maya's instinct screamed at her to step back, but she held her ground. "Are you seriously going to escalate this further?" she asked, her tone sharp with disbelief. "In front of all these people? In front of cameras?" Blake glanced around briefly, his gaze darting to the windows and phones held discreetly by some of the onlookers. The realization that he might already be on camera seemed to rattle him, but only slightly. "You don't scare me," Blake said, his voice a low growl. "You think you've got leverage because you can talk big. You're nothing, just another loudmouth trying to act important. And you're just another officer hiding behind a badge to justify your prejudice." Maya shot back, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. For a moment, the two stood in a charged silence, the weight of the standoff pressing down on everyone watching. Blake's fingers flexed on his holster, his posture stiff with restrained aggression. Maya didn't flinch. Instead, she slowly raised her hands, not in surrender, but as a calculated gesture to de-escalate. "Think carefully," she said, her tone quiet but firm. What happens next will define your career, maybe even your life. Are you ready for that? Blake's expression twisted with frustration, the tension between them thick enough to cut. His hand hovered over his gun for a second longer before he finally stepped back, his breathing heavy. You think you've won, he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. This isn't over. Maya lowered her hands, her eyes never leaving him. You're right, she said evenly. It's not. Blake glared at her for another moment before turning sharply and stalking back toward his car. He slammed the door shut, the sound echoing through the silent street. Maya exhaled slowly, her adrenaline still coursing. She stooped to pick up her scattered belongings, her movements deliberate. Around her, the neighbors who had gathered began to retreat, their windows closing and doors shutting, as if they wanted to erase what they'd just witnessed. She glanced once more at the patrol car as it drove off, the siren briefly wailing before it disappeared around the corner. This wasn't just about one man's abuse of power. Maya could feel the ripples of something much larger. A system, a mindset, a history that was alive and well in Riverside Heights. Blake's car screeched to a sudden stop just a few yards down the street. Maya barely had time to process his reappearance before he flung the door open and stepped out, his hand already resting on the grip of his gun. You didn't think I was done with you, did you? He barked, his voice cutting through the tense air. Maya didn't respond. She stood her ground, her body rigid but controlled, her years of training keeping her outwardly calm. Blake's hand moved faster than she anticipated. In one fluid motion, he drew his gun and leveled it directly at her chest. Get down, he shouted, his tone commanding and filled with hostility. Maya's breath caught for a fraction of a second, but she forced herself to stay composed. Slowly, she raised her hands, palms out, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. Officer, she said evenly, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. You don't want to do this. I said get down, Blake roared, taking a step closer. His eyes were wild, his grip on the weapon tight. Maya didn't move. Let's think this through, she said, her voice calm but firm. You're escalating a situation that doesn't need to go this far. Put the gun down. Blake's face twisted into a sneer. You think you're the one in control here? He gestured sharply with the barrel of the gun. I said, on your knees, now! Maya hesitated, calculating her next move. She didn't want to provoke him further, but the situation was spiraling out of control. Slowly, she lowered herself to one knee, her eyes never leaving his. There, she said, her tone measured. You've got what you want. Now, let's de-escalate this. Blake took another step forward, his gun still trained on her. You don't tell me what to do, he snapped. This is my neighborhood, my rules, and you don't belong here. Maya's mind raced. Every word, every gesture from Blake confirmed what she already suspected. This wasn't just about a perceived violation of the law. This was personal, fueled by prejudice and unchecked power. Before she could respond, Blake lunged forward and kicked her leg out from under her. The unexpected force sent her sprawling onto the ground, pain shooting through her knee. Still think I'm playing games? Blake snarled, his voice dripping with venom. You need to learn your place. Maya fought back the urge to retaliate, knowing it would only worsen the situation. Instead, she shifted slightly, her fingers brushing the edge of her shirt. With a quick but subtle motion, she activated the hidden camera clipped to her top. The small device blinked silently, capturing every word and movement. You just made a big mistake, she said, her voice low but steady. Everything you're doing is being recorded. Blake hesitated for a split second, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. But his arrogance quickly reasserted itself. You think I care about your little games? He growled, his gun still pointed at her. No one's going to believe you, not against me. Maya shifted her weight, wincing as her knee throbbed. We'll see about that, she said. But you're digging yourself into a hole you won't climb out of. Blake stepped closer, the muzzle of his gun now just feet from her. You think you're untouchable? He spat. You think waving a camera around is going to save you? You're nothing here. Maya met his gaze, her expression unflinching. And you're a cop, pulling a gun on an unarmed woman in her own neighborhood. Who do you think people are going to believe when they see this footage? Blake's jaw tightened, his frustration evident. He paced back and forth, the gun still in his hand, his movements erratic. Shut up, he muttered, though it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself. Maya seized the moment. "You're out of control," she said, her voice firm but not antagonistic. "Put the gun down before you do something you can't take back." Blake stopped pacing and turned to her, his eyes blazing. "You don't get it, do you?" he hissed. "I run this place, not you, not anyone else. Me." Maya straightened slightly, ignoring the pain in her leg. "You're about to lose everything you think you control," she said. "Because this isn't just between you and me anymore. This is evidence." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. For a moment, Blake looked unsure, his bravado cracking under the weight of what he'd done. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "You think you've won?" he said, his voice shaking slightly. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." Maya tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. "You're right," she said. "It's not over. But it's not going to end the way you think." Blake's face twisted into a scowl, but he didn't respond. Instead, he holstered his gun with a sharp motion, his movements jerky and filled with suppressed rage. "Stay out of my way," he muttered, his voice low and threatening. "Or you'll regret it." He turned and stalked back to his car, slamming the door shut behind him. The sound of the engine roared to life, and he sped off, the squeal of his tires echoing in the quiet street. Maya stayed on the ground for a moment, her heart pounding and her mind racing. Slowly, she pushed herself to her feet, her body aching, but her resolve unshaken. She reached up and turned off the camera, knowing she had what she needed. As she collected her scattered belongings, her thoughts were clear. This wasn't just about Blake's actions. It was about a system that allowed him to act with impunity. The patrol car pulled up just as Maya finished brushing herself off. She stood on the curb, her phone still in hand, watching as two uniformed officers stepped out. One of them was a tall man in his 50s, his gray hair neatly trimmed and his expression stern. The badge on his chest read, "David Harper, the local police chief." Maya waved them over, her posture steady despite the bruises forming on her leg. Harper approached first, his eyes flicking between her and the scattered items still on the ground. "Agent Carter?" he asked. "That's right," Maya replied. "I called. You'll want to hear what your officer has been up to." Before Harper could respond, Blake's patrol car screeched to a halt a few feet away. He stormed out, his face flushed with anger. "Chief," he called, his voice sharp. "Glad you're here. I've been dealing with a situation." Blake pointed at Maya with the air of someone trying to establish control. "This woman has been acting suspiciously in the neighborhood. Refused to cooperate when I asked for ID." Harper frowned, but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned back to Maya. "You said there's been an incident?" "There's more than that," Maya said firmly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device, the camera she'd activated during her encounter with Blake. "I've got video evidence of what happened, and I can assure you, it's not me who's been acting suspiciously." Blake's confident demeanor faltered for a moment. "She's twisting the story," he snapped, stepping closer to Harper. "You know how people like this operate, always looking for trouble." Maya's eyes narrowed, but she kept her tone steady. "Play the footage, Chief. Let the video speak for itself." Harper nodded, taking the device from her. He signaled to the second officer, who pulled out a tablet to connect it. Within seconds, the video played back. The recording was crystal clear. Every word Blake had said, every move he'd made, it was all there. From his threats to draw his weapon to the moment he kicked Maya to the ground, the evidence was damning. The street fell silent as the playback ended. Harper's expression hardened as he turned to Blake. "Explain this," he said, his voice low but commanding. Blake's face twisted with desperation. "She's manipulating the situation," he shouted. "You know how these people are, always trying to make us look bad." "That's enough," Harper cut him off, his tone sharp. "The evidence speaks for itself." Blake's fists clenched at his sides, his composure slipping. "I was doing my job," he barked. "Protecting this neighborhood. She doesn't belong here." "Your job," Harper said coldly, "doesn't include assaulting unarmed civilians or abusing your authority. And I don't need to remind you that pulling a gun on someone without cause is a criminal act." Blake's frustration boiled over. "I've been here for 15 years, he yelled. "I know what's best for this community." "And now," Harper replied, stepping closer, You're going to answer for what you've done. He turned to the second officer. Cuff him. Blake's eyes widened. What? You're arresting me? For this? The second officer approached, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Turn around, he instructed. Blake backed away, his movements jerky. You're making a mistake, he growled. She's the problem, not me. Harper didn't waver. You've crossed the line, Blake. And you know it. Blake's defiance finally cracked as the officer grabbed his arm and pulled it behind his back. This is ridiculous, Blake shouted, struggling briefly before the cuffs clicked into place. You're siding with her over me. I've given my life to this job, and you've just thrown it away, Harper said flatly. As Blake was led toward the patrol car, he turned his head to glare at Maya. His eyes burned with anger and something darker, a simmering hatred that sent a chill down her spine. You'll regret this, he hissed. Maya didn't flinch. She met his gaze head on. No, she said firmly. You will. Blake was shoved into the back seat of the patrol car, the door slamming shut behind him. Harper watched for a moment before turning back to Maya. I'll need your statement, Agent Carter, he said, his tone more professional now. And I'll make sure this gets to the district attorney's office immediately. Good, Maya replied, adjusting her stance. Because I'm not letting this slide. Harper nodded, his expression grim. Neither am I. The patrol car pulled away, Blake's silhouette barely visible through the tinted windows. Maya stood on the sidewalk, the tension in her body finally easing, but only slightly. The morning after Blake's arrest, Maya submitted the footage from her hidden camera to the district attorney's office. The video was damning, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Within hours, the case triggered an internal investigation at the Riverside Heights Police Department. The investigation revealed more than Maya had anticipated. As officials reviewed complaints filed against Blake over the years, a disturbing pattern emerged. Reports of harassment, unwarranted stops, and excessive force had been quietly dismissed or ignored. Several of Blake's colleagues were implicated, not only for failing to act, but for actively covering up his misconduct. At a tense press conference, Police Chief Harper addressed the findings. This department is committed to transparency and accountability, he said, his tone firm. Any officer found complicit in these actions will face disciplinary measures and, if necessary, legal consequences. The announcement sent shockwaves through the department. Officers who had worked alongside Blake now found themselves under scrutiny. Their actions, or lack thereof, examined in painful detail. The thin blue line was fracturing, and resentment began to brew among those who felt betrayed by the exposure. Meanwhile, the community's reaction was polarizing. While some residents expressed gratitude for Maya's courage, others saw her as a disruptive outsider. Within days, protesters began gathering near her home. One evening, as Maya returned from work, she found a group of residents holding signs that read things like, "Leave our community alone" and "Stop making trouble." Their chants were loud and accusatory, echoing through the quiet streets. Maya stepped out of her car, her posture unyielding. She locked eyes with one of the protesters, a middle-aged man holding a megaphone. "You're ruining this neighborhood," he shouted, pointing at her. "We never had problems like this until you showed up." Maya didn't respond. She wasn't here to win popularity contests. But the animosity in their faces made it clear that she was facing more than just professional challenges. This was personal. The hostility escalated later that week. At 2 a.m., Maya woke to the sound of shattering glass. She bolted upright, her FBI training kicking in immediately. Grabbing the firearm she kept by her bed, she moved swiftly but cautiously toward the noise. In the living room, she found chaos. A brick had smashed through the front window, and shards of glass littered the floor. Outside, the faint sound of footsteps echoed as whoever was responsible fled into the night. Her phone buzzed on the counter, motion alerts from her security cameras. She reviewed the footage, which showed a group of masked individuals hurling rocks and bottles at her home. One bottle, filled with liquid, had ignited briefly before burning out on the pavement. Maya called the FBI immediately. "This isn't just a one-off attack," she said, her voice steely. "It's an escalation." By the time agents arrived, neighbors had begun peeking out of their windows, drawn by the commotion. But just like during her confrontation with Blake, no one offered to help. The agents swept the area for evidence, collecting fragments of the thrown bottles and reviewing Maya's camera footage. One agent turned to her. "We'll enhance the video and run it through facial recognition. We'll find them." Maya nodded, though she felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. This wasn't just a random act of vandalism. It was a message. The attack only fueled her determination. At a meeting with the district attorney and Chief Harper the next day, Maya was direct. "This isn't just about Blake or his accomplices. This is about a culture that allows people like him to thrive. If you don't tackle that, this will keep happening." Harper sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You're right," he admitted. "But change like this takes time, and the department is already under fire. We're balancing on a knife's edge." "You don't have time," Maya countered. "The longer you wait, the more damage is done, not just to the victims, but to the credibility of the system." The tension in the room was palpable, but Harper nodded. "We'll push harder," he said. "I'll make sure this investigation doesn't stall." As the investigation deepened, Maya became a target not just of local resentment, but of coordinated backlash. Anonymous emails flooded her inbox, filled with threats and slurs. Social media posts painted her as a troublemaker, someone who didn't respect authority. But the attacks only clarified her resolve. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been silenced, ignored, or intimidated. One night, while reviewing case files at her dining table, she paused to glance at the broken window, now temporarily covered with plywood. She realized that the fight she was waging wasn't just against individuals like Blake. It was against an entrenched system that resisted accountability at every turn. Maya set down her files and picked up her phone, scrolling through the messages of support she had received from strangers. One stood out. "Thank you for standing up. You're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for all of us." With that, Maya refocused her efforts. She contacted advocacy groups, reached out to other victims of abuse, and began to build a coalition. She wasn't just fighting back. She was building something bigger than herself. Maya's decision to release the video wasn't made lightly. She knew the risks, but the footage needed to be seen. When the video went live, it spread like wildfire. Within hours, news outlets picked it up, and social media exploded with reactions. The hashtags, Justice for Maya and Accountability Now, began trending, with millions watching Blake's abuse of power unfold. Outrage poured in from across the country. People demanded accountability, not just for Blake, but for the entire system that had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. Protests sprang up in support of Maya, with demonstrators carrying signs that read, "Enough is enough," and "Power has limits." But the response wasn't universally supportive. A counter-narrative emerged, led by Blake's defenders. A vocal group of residents and former colleagues painted Maya as a troublemaker, accusing her of overreacting and tarnishing a good officer's reputation. Online forums filled with vitriol, blaming her for causing division in the community. At a local town hall meeting, tensions boiled over. Maya attended to address the community's concerns, but the atmosphere was hostile from the start. "You've turned this place into a media circus," one man shouted, his face red with anger. "This used to be a peaceful neighborhood before you showed up." Maya stood at the podium, calm but resolute. "This isn't about disrupting peace," she said firmly. "It's about holding people accountable. If you think what happened is acceptable, you're part of the problem." The room erupted in shouts, half in agreement, half in opposition. Maya stood her ground, her voice rising above the chaos. "Silence won't fix this. Ignoring the issue won't make it go away. Change requires action." The meeting ended in a stalemate, the divide in the community more apparent than ever. The backlash took a darker turn one night as Maya sat in her living room, reviewing notes on the ongoing investigation. Through her window, she noticed the headlights of a car parked across the street. It had been there for over an hour, engine idling, its driver invisible behind tinted windows. Maya's instincts kicked in. She grabbed her phone and moved cautiously toward the door. As she stepped outside, the car's headlights flared brighter. "Can I help you?" she called, her voice steady but loud enough to carry. The engine roared and the car lunged forward. Maya jumped back, her body reacting faster than her mind, as the vehicle sped toward her driveway. She barely avoided being hit, landing hard on the grass as the car veered away and disappeared into the night. Her hands trembled as she stood, brushing dirt from her clothes. She dialed the FBI field office immediately. "I've got a situation," she said, her voice clipped. "I need backup and surveillance deployed to my residence." Within minutes, agents arrived, combing the area for evidence. One of them examined tire marks left in the driveway. "This wasn't random," he said grimly. "Someone's sending a message." Maya nodded. "Then we need to send one back." "Find them!" The near miss was a wake-up call. Maya realized that this wasn't just about her. It was about a system that had allowed people like Blake to feel untouchable. It wasn't enough to hold one officer accountable. Real change required a broader effort. The next day, she contacted allies within the Bureau and several legal advocacy groups. Together, they began drafting plans for a non-profit organization aimed at supporting victims of abuse of power and systemic injustice. "We're calling it Justice for All," Maya explained during a meeting with potential backers. "This isn't just about what happened to me. It's about making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." The organization quickly gained traction, drawing support from activists, lawyers, and community leaders. Maya's story became the catalyst for a movement, sparking conversations about police reform and accountability nationwide. Though the threats continued, so did Maya's resolve. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, overlooked, or dismissed. The launch of Justice for All was anything but smooth. Within days of announcing the nonprofit, Maya faced an onslaught of sabotage. Social media lit up with fabricated claims about her intentions. Posts circulated accusing her of being a race baiter, anti-police, and even a fraud exploiting the system for personal gain. Anonymous emails flooded the organization's inbox, filled with threats and slurs. Maya read them without flinching, but the strain on her small team was evident. Volunteers worried about their safety, and some quietly left, unwilling to face the mounting hostility. The attacks didn't stop at words. Late one night, Maya received a frantic call from her office manager. "Someone broke in," the woman whispered, her voice shaking. "The place is a mess. Files everywhere. They smashed the security cameras." Maya arrived within minutes, her FBI badge clipped to her belt. The office was in shambles. Papers were scattered, desks overturned, and a computer had been yanked off its desk and smashed. "Nothing critical was taken," the office manager said nervously. "But they wanted to send a message." "They did," Maya replied, her tone steely. "But so will we." She immediately contacted law enforcement and ordered an upgrade to the office's security system. Additional cameras, reinforced locks, and remote backups for every document became standard. "If they think this will scare us off," she told her staff, "they're wrong." The tension escalated during a public forum meant to address concerns about the organization. Maya stood at the front of a crowded community center, her presence commanding but calm. The room was filled with a mix of supporters and detractors, the air electric with barely contained hostility. As Maya began to speak, a man in the back interrupted. "You think you're a hero?" he shouted, his voice thick with anger. "You're just stirring up trouble. We didn't ask for your help." Maya paused, meeting his glare. "I'm here because this isn't just about one person's experience. It's about creating a system that works for everyone." Her words seemed to ignite him further. "For everyone?" he sneered. "You mean for people like you. You don't care about this community. You just want attention." The crowd murmured, tension rippling through the room. Maya stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "This community deserves better. And if holding people accountable makes you uncomfortable, maybe you should ask yourself why." The man didn't reply. Instead, he picked up a folding chair and hurled it toward her. The chair sailed through the air, narrowly missing Maya as she stepped back instinctively. Gasps erupted from the crowd as two police officers rushed in, restraining the man and escorting him out. Maya stood her ground, her pulse pounding but her composure intact. "This," she said, gesturing toward the chaos, "is why change is necessary. Fear and violence are the tools of those who don't want accountability. But they won't stop us." The crowd's response was mixed. Some clapped, others grumbled, but Maya's resolve only hardened. After the meeting, Maya sat in her car, her mind racing. The attacks, the sabotage, the physical threats, it was more than she'd anticipated. This wasn't just about Blake anymore. It was about a system so deeply entrenched in its ways that even the idea of change provoked outrage. She called a trusted friend and fellow advocate Elena Vargas, a seasoned civil rights attorney. "I need advice," Maya said. "This is getting bigger than I expected. The resistance, it's everywhere." Elena's voice was calm but firm. "That means you're doing something right," she said. "They only fight this hard when they know they're losing control. But you can't do this alone. Build alliances, expand your base, make this movement so big they can't ignore it." Maya took Elena's words to heart. She began reaching out to community leaders, legal experts, and activists across the country. Donations started pouring in, and volunteers returned, inspired by her unyielding determination. Maya locked up the Justice for All office late one evening, the sound of the heavy door clicking shut echoing in the quiet street. Her bag slung over one shoulder, she walked toward her car, parked in the dimly lit lot a few blocks away. Her instincts warned her before she saw them. The faint shuffle of footsteps, too many to be casual, and the soft murmur of voices behind her. She glanced back, her sharp eyes catching the silhouettes of three figures closing in. They weren't here to talk. Maya's pulse quickened, but she didn't panic. Years of FBI training kicked in, sharpening her focus. She adjusted her grip on her bag, shifting it to free her dominant hand. "Hey!" one of them shouted. The group sped up, spreading out to box her in. Maya stopped abruptly, turning to face them. "Is there something you need?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The leader, a burly man with a baseball cap pulled low over his face, smirked. "Yeah," he said, stepping closer. "We need you to stop stirring up trouble around here." His words were a thinly veiled threat, but Maya stood her ground. "If you think intimidating me will work, you've got the wrong person." The man didn't respond. Instead, he lunged, his hand reaching for her arm. Maya reacted instantly. She twisted her body, breaking his grip, and drove her elbow into his ribs. He stumbled back with a grunt, clutching his side. Another man came at her from the left, swinging wildly. Maya sidestepped, catching his wrist and using his momentum to flip him onto the ground. The third hesitated, his confidence visibly shaken. The leader recovered quickly, pulling a knife from his pocket. He charged again, but Maya was ready. She grabbed her bag and swung it with precision, the heavy contents slamming into his wrist. The knife clattered to the pavement, and he stumbled back with a curse. "Enough!" she barked, her voice cutting through the tension. "Walk away. Now!" The men exchanged uncertain glances before retreating, their bravado shattered. Maya watched them disappear into the shadows, her heart pounding but her expression unyielding. She picked up the discarded knife, wrapping it in a cloth from her bag. Evidence. As she reached her car and locked the doors, Maya's determination solidified further. If they thought fear would stop her, they had underestimated her resolve. The attack on Maya didn't stay under wraps for long. Security camera footage from a nearby building captured the incident, and within hours it was circulating online. Public outrage surged once again, with demands for increased protection for Maya and an end to the harassment she faced. The attention brought renewed scrutiny to the Riverside Heights Police Department. Protesters gathered outside the station, holding signs that read, "Clean up the force," and "Accountability now." Media outlets bombarded Chief Harper with questions, forcing him to address the growing unrest. Harper stepped up to the podium at a hastily arranged press conference. "We acknowledge the public's concerns and take them seriously," he said. "An internal review is ongoing, and changes are already being implemented to ensure transparency and integrity within our department." But the pressure didn't stop there. The district attorney's office announced that it was expanding its investigation into Blake's previous cases, uncovering a disturbing number of incidents involving excessive force and abuse of power. It wasn't just Blake under fire anymore. Several of his colleagues, those who had turned a blind eye or actively covered for him, found themselves suspended pending investigation. Among them were senior officers who had held key roles in shaping department policy. The ripple effects were felt throughout the community. Longtime residents began sharing stories of their own encounters with officers like Blake, their voices finally amplified by the national spotlight on Riverside Heights. Maya watched the developments unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and resolve. Each step toward accountability was hard-won, but it was proof that change was possible. She met with Harper privately a week later, the tension between them palpable. "Your department is under siege," Maya said bluntly. Harper sighed, his weariness showing. "I know," he admitted. "And it's going to take years to rebuild trust, if we can at all." "Then start now," Maya said. "Real reform, not just promises, but action. This is bigger than Blake. It's about the system that let him operate unchecked for so long." Harper nodded slowly. "We're drafting new oversight measures," he said. "Body cameras, independent audits, a complete review of training protocols. It won't fix everything overnight, but it's a start." "It's not just about fixing what's broken," Maya replied. "It's about proving that accountability isn't optional. If you want to regain trust, you need to lead by example." Harper looked her in the eye, his expression unreadable. "You don't hold back, do you?" "Not when lives are at stake," Maya said. The reforms began rolling out within weeks. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers on patrol, and an independent oversight committee was established to handle complaints against the department. The changes didn't come without resistance. Some officers grumbled about the added scrutiny, while a handful openly resigned, claiming the measures were anti-police. But the community response was overwhelmingly positive, with many residents expressing renewed hope for a safer and fairer system. For Maya, the progress was a vindication of everything she had endured. The attacks, the threats, the relentless opposition. It had all been worth it, but she knew the fight wasn't over. The system wasn't fixed, not by a long shot. There were still battles to be fought, voices to be heard, and changes to be made. As she left a meeting with the Oversight Committee one evening, her phone buzzed with a notification. A message from an unknown sender. "You can't fix this. Give up now." Maya stared at the screen for a long moment before deleting the message. Not a chance, she thought. The hearing room buzzed with tension as Maya Carter took her seat at the witness table. In front of her, a panel of lawmakers prepared to grill her about the proposed bill that would mandate body cameras for all law enforcement officers in the state. The measure had drawn fierce debate, and today's hearing was expected to be explosive. Maya adjusted the microphone in front of her, her expression calm but focused. She wasn't here to debate for the sake of arguing. She was here to win. The chairperson introduced her, outlining her role in exposing systemic abuse and her advocacy for the legislation. But before Maya could begin her testimony, one of the lawmakers, Representative Charles Grayson, a staunch opponent of the bill, leaned forward, his voice cutting. "Ms. Carter," he began, "I think we can all agree that what you experienced was unfortunate. But don't you think this bill goes too far? Isn't it a bit much to suggest that all officers should be treated like criminals before they've done anything wrong?" Maya held his gaze, her tone measured. "With respect, Representative Grayson, this bill isn't about treating officers like criminals. It's about accountability. Body cameras protect both civilians and law enforcement by providing an unbiased record of interactions." Grayson smirked, leaning back in his chair. "That sounds good in theory, but in practice? These cameras are expensive, they're invasive, and frankly, they're an overreach of government authority." Maya didn't flinch. "What's more invasive, Representative? Wearing a camera while on duty, or having your civil rights violated with no recourse? Transparency isn't an overreach, it's a necessity." The room fell silent for a moment, the tension palpable. Grayson leaned forward again, clearly intending to push harder. "So you're saying we should burden our already strained police departments with additional costs and regulations, all because of a few bad apples?" Maya's expression hardened. "This isn't about a few bad apples," she said, her voice rising. "It's about a culture that allows misconduct to go unchecked. Body cameras aren't just a tool, they're a safeguard. And if you're more worried about costs than accountability, maybe you need to rethink your priorities." Murmurs rippled through the room. Maya could see some of the panel members shifting uncomfortably in their seats, but she pressed on. "Let me remind you that transparency doesn't just benefit the public. It protects good officers. The vast majority of law enforcement professionals do their jobs with integrity. Cameras ensure their actions are accurately documented, preventing false accusations." Grayson opened his mouth to retort, but the chairperson cut him off. "Representative, let Miss Carter finish her statement." Maya turned back to the panel, her voice steady. "This bill isn't an attack on law enforcement. it's a step toward rebuilding trust. Without accountability, that trust will continue to erode, and no one benefits from that. Not officers, not the public, and not the communities we're all trying to protect. The hearing lasted for hours, with Maya fielding questions and countering arguments from skeptical lawmakers. By the end, even some of the staunchest opponents seemed swayed by her calm, yet unrelenting logic. A week later, the bill went to a vote. Maya watched from the gallery, her heart pounding as the results were announced. Approved by a narrow margin. Applause erupted from the supporters in the room, but Maya remained seated, letting the moment sink in. This was more than a personal victory. It was a tangible step toward systemic change. The passage of the bill sent shockwaves through the state. Police departments began preparing for the implementation of body cameras, and training sessions were scheduled to ensure officers understood how to use the technology effectively. Critics continued to voice their opposition, but the momentum was undeniable. Media outlets highlighted the bill as a landmark achievement in the fight for accountability and transparency. Maya's name became synonymous with the movement, her story inspiring similar efforts in other states. At a press conference held shortly after the bill's passage, Maya stood behind the podium, flanked by lawmakers and activists who had supported the effort. Cameras flashed as she began to speak. "This isn't the end of the fight," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "This is just the beginning. Accountability isn't optional. It's the foundation of justice. And justice isn't something we wait for. It's something we demand, something we fight for, and something we create." As she stepped away from the podium, a reporter called out, "Ms. Carter, how do you respond to those who say this bill is an overreach?" Maya turned, her gaze sharp. "I'd say they should ask the families who've lost loved ones because no one was held accountable. Ask the officers who've been falsely accused and wish they had a camera to prove their innocence. Transparency protects everyone. If we want safer communities, we need to embrace it." Within months, the effects of the new law began to show. Complaints against officers dropped in precincts that had implemented body cameras, and several disputes were resolved swiftly with the help of footage. For Maya, the victory was bittersweet. She knew there was still much work to be done, but for the first time, she felt the tide beginning to turn. Change was slow, but it was happening. And that was worth every battle she'd fought. Maya drove home late one evening, exhaustion tugging at her focus. The past weeks had been relentless. Press conferences, meetings, and the mounting pressure of implementing the new body camera policy. Yet, despite her fatigue, she felt a quiet satisfaction. Progress, though slow, was tangible. Her car approached an intersection near her neighborhood, the streetlights casting faint glows over the deserted road. As she slowed to make a turn, headlights suddenly flared behind her, bright and unyielding. A black SUV barreled toward her at full speed, closing the distance in seconds. Maya reacted instinctively, swerving hard to avoid a collision. The SUV clipped her rear bumper, sending her car spinning out of control. Her tires screeched against the pavement before the vehicle came to a jarring halt against a lamppost. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her heart racing as she assessed her injuries. Aside from a throbbing pain in her shoulder where the seatbelt had dug in, she was unharmed. The SUV didn't stop. It sped past her wrecked car, disappearing into the night. Maya grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "This is Maya Carter," she said. "I've been involved in a hit and run. Location is 34th and Elm. Suspect vehicle is a black SUV, unknown plate number. Request immediate assistance." Minutes later, police officers and paramedics arrived. Maya refused medical transport, insisting her injuries were minor. Instead, she focused on the officers, providing a detailed account of what had happened. "This wasn't random," she told the lead officer. "Whoever was driving knew exactly who I was. This was intentional." The following day, Maya sat in her office, her arm in a sling as she sifted through paperwork. The incident weighed heavily on her, but she refused to let fear dictate her actions. If anything, the attack had only solidified her resolve. As she worked, her assistant knocked on the door, holding an envelope. "This came for you," she said, setting it on the desk. Maya opened it, her curiosity piqued. Inside was a handwritten letter on lined notebook paper. "Dear Ms. Carter, my name is Chloe. I'm 12 years old and I live in Springfield. I've been watching the news and reading about everything you've done. I want to thank you for being so brave." The letter went on to describe Chloe's own struggles. She wrote about being bullied at school because of her skin color, and how seeing Maya stand up for what was right had inspired her to do the same. "You make me feel like I can be strong too. One day I want to help people just like you do. You're my hero. Thank you for not giving up. Love, Chloe." Maya read the letter twice, the words sinking in deeper each time. Her throat tightened, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. This was why she fought. Not for headlines, not for recognition, but for the countless voices like Chloe's. Voices that needed someone to stand up and say, "You matter." She folded the letter carefully, placing it in her desk drawer. The pain in her shoulder was a reminder of the risks she faced, but Chloe's words were a reminder of the stakes. Maya leaned back in her chair, her resolve hardening once more. Chloe and countless others were counting on her, and she wouldn't let them down. The conference hall was packed with people from all walks of life: activists, lawmakers, journalists, and concerned citizens. The National Conference on Justice Reform was a pivotal event, and Maya Carter had been invited as the keynote speaker. The air buzzed with anticipation as attendees settled into their seats. Maya stepped onto the stage, her posture commanding and her expression resolute. She glanced briefly at the sea of faces before her, her mind rehearsing the key points of her speech. But as she approached the podium, her attention snagged on a young man sitting in the front row. He stood out, not because of his demeanor, but because she recognized him. He had the same sharp jawline and intense eyes as Rick Blake. Maya's grip on the edges of the podium tightened momentarily. She hadn't expected this. The young man stood up, and the room fell silent, the weight of his presence palpable. "Ms. Carter," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I'm Jason Blake. My father, Rick Blake, was the officer you exposed." A murmur rippled through the audience, but Jason raised a hand, silencing them. He turned his gaze to Maya, his expression sincere. "I wanted to come here today to say something I know my father never will. I'm sorry. For everything." Maya remained still, letting him speak. "What my father did was wrong. And while I can't undo the harm he caused, I can acknowledge it. Watching your courage, your refusal to back down, taught me something important, that justice isn't about protecting those who abuse power. It's about holding them accountable, no matter how uncomfortable it is." The room was silent, every eye fixed on Jason. He swallowed hard, then continued. "I used to idolize my father. But now I see the difference between strength and abuse, between authority and tyranny. And I want to thank you for opening my eyes, for opening everyone's eyes." Jason sat down, and the audience erupted into applause. Maya took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking. "Thank you, Jason," she said, her voice carrying through the room. "It takes courage to admit when someone you love is in the wrong. And it takes even more courage to choose a different path." She paused, allowing the moment to settle, then launched into her speech. "Justice," Maya began, her voice unwavering, "is not an abstract concept. It's not a word on a page or a slogan chanted in the streets. Justice is action. It's accountability. It's the willingness to stand up, even when it feels like the world is against you." She scanned the crowd, her gaze firm. But justice doesn't happen on its own. It requires all of us. Every voice, every effort, every act of courage. And here's the truth. When you stand for justice, you're never standing alone. The audience leaned in, captivated. "When I started this fight, I thought it was about one person, one incident. But it's so much bigger than that. It's about a system that needs to change, about communities that need healing, and about the countless people who've been silenced for too long." Maya's tone softened, but her conviction remained. "I've faced resistance. I've faced threats. But what keeps me going are the voices of those who believe in this fight. People like Chloe, a 12-year-old girl who wrote to me about finding strength in this movement. It's for her, and for all the Chloes out there, that we keep pushing forward." The room erupted into applause, but Maya held up a hand, signaling for quiet. "This isn't about me," she said. "This is about us. Together, we can create a system where justice isn't a privilege. It's a guarantee." And that work starts now. As Maya stepped down from the podium, the applause was deafening. People stood, clapping and cheering, their support a tangible force. Maya moved through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging words of encouragement. Jason approached her again, his expression earnest. "Thank you for letting me speak," he said. Maya nodded. "Thank you for having the courage to do it." Change starts with moments like this. As she stepped outside into the evening air, she saw the crowd that had gathered outside the venue. People held signs that read, "Justice for all," and "Accountability is strength." The sight filled Maya with a renewed sense of purpose. She stood among them, the glow of streetlights casting soft halos over the faces of the people who had joined her fight. They were diverse, different races, ages, and backgrounds, but united by a shared belief in the power of justice. Maya raised a hand, acknowledging their support. The cheers grew louder, echoing into the night. This was just the beginning. The journey ahead would be long, but Maya knew she wasn't walking it alone. With every step, she was helping to carve a path toward a future where justice wasn't just an ideal, it was a reality. And she wouldn't stop until that reality was achieved. What about you? How would you stand up for justice in your own community? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your stories. If Maya's journey inspired you, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who need to hear this message, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that ignite change. Together, we can make a difference.
The rain fell relentlessly on the sleepy streets of Silver Creek, a quiet town nestled in the rolling hills of Northern California. Water streamed down the windows of the small diners and shops that lined the main road, painting a hazy reflection of the neon open signs and puddles along the sidewalks. In the heart of this modest town, FBI Special Agent Marcus Bennett exited a nondescript sedan, his dark trench coat pulled tightly around his broad shoulders to shield himself from the downpour. Marcus, a tall, composed man in his early 40s, had just wrapped up a long surveillance operation targeting a money laundering ring connected to a local business. Despite his exhaustion, he walked with an air of confidence, one cultivated by years of facing high-pressure situations. His presence, however, was not met with the same confidence by others. Silver Creek was the kind of town where outsiders were immediately noticed, and a black man in a suit, even one as unassuming as Marcus, drew attention. As Marcus approached his car, he felt a gaze on him, a lingering, weighty suspicion that was all too familiar. He glanced over his shoulder and saw a patrol car idling a few feet away. Behind the wheel sat Officer Ethan Caldwell, a stocky man in his late 30s with closely cropped blonde hair and a jaw that seemed perpetually clenched. Ethan's face was as tense as his grip on the steering wheel, his eyes narrowing as he observed Marcus with visible skepticism. "Hey!" Ethan called out suddenly, stepping out of his cruiser. The door slammed behind him, and the sound echoed down the empty street. "You there? Stop right where you are." Marcus froze mid-step, instinctively raising his hands slightly to shoulder height, palms out. His FBI training kicked in immediately, telling him to de-escalate. But this wasn't new territory for him. Marcus had encountered men like Ethan before, men who carried prejudice as part of their uniform. "Yes, officer," Marcus said evenly, his voice calm despite the irritation bubbling beneath his surface. "What are you doing here?" Ethan demanded, his hand already resting on the butt of his holstered firearm. His tone carried the sharp edge of authority, mixed with something more sinister. Doubt, mistrust, and a simmering hostility. "You look out of place." Marcus arched an eyebrow, his lips tightening. "Out of place," he repeated, carefully choosing his words. "I'm parked here. That's all." Ethan took a step closer, his boots splashing in the shallow puddles forming on the pavement. "Let me see some ID," he barked. Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of defiance, but because he knew where this was heading. He had lived through it before, being questioned for walking in the wrong neighborhood, being followed in stores, being doubted in spaces he had every right to occupy. Slowly, He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his leather badge case, flipping it open to reveal his FBI credentials. "I'm Special Agent Marcus Bennett," he said firmly, holding the badge out for Ethan to inspect. "I'm with the FBI. I've just finished an assignment in this area." Ethan's eyes flicked to the badge, his scowl deepening. He didn't even lean in to examine it. Instead, he snorted and shook his head. "That's fake," he said bluntly. Marcus blinked. "Excuse me?" "I said that's fake," Ethan repeated, louder this time. He took another step forward, his posture stiff and confrontational. "I don't know who you think you're fooling, but there's no way someone like you is an FBI agent." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "Someone like me?" he asked, his voice still measured but carrying a sharp undertone. "You heard me," Ethan shot back. "You're walking around here, dressed like that, flashing some fake badge, thinking I'm going to let it slide? I don't think so. Hands on your head. Now." For a moment, Marcus didn't move. The absurdity of the situation struck him, but so did the weight of the implications. He could see the trembling in Ethan's hand as it hovered near his gun. He could hear the tension in his voice, the kind of tension that could escalate into something far worse if Marcus made the wrong move. "Officer Caldwell," Marcus said slowly, lowering his hands to his sides. "You're making a mistake. My badge is real. You can call the FBI field office in Sacramento to confirm my identity." "I don't need to call anyone," Ethan snapped. "What I need is for you to stop resisting and get on the ground before I make you." Marcus's jaw tightened. He stood his ground, unwilling to comply with the humiliating demand. "I'm not resisting," he said firmly. "I've identified myself. There's no reason for this." "No reason?" Ethan scoffed, his voice rising. "The reason is you're not supposed to be here. People around here don't take kindly to." "Ethan," a sharp voice cut through the tension, and both men turned to see a woman standing a few feet away, her smartphone held in front of her like a shield. Rachel McCarthy, a young journalist with fiery red hair and an equally fiery passion for uncovering the truth, was recording the entire exchange. "What the hell are you doing?" Rachel demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of outrage and fear. "He's done nothing wrong. You can't treat him like this." Ethan's face flushed with anger, and he pointed at her. "Stay out of this, Rachel. This has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with me," Rachel shot back, stepping closer. "And it has everything to do with this town. You can't just harass someone because you don't like the way they look." Ethan glared at her, but before he could respond, another car pulled up. A tall man in his late 50s stepped out, his salt and pepper hair and neatly trimmed beard lending him an air of authority. Detective Paul Grayson, the chief of the Silver Creek Police Department, approached quickly, his face a mask of concern. "What's going on here?" Grayson demanded, his eyes darting between Marcus, Ethan, and Rachel. Ethan immediately straightened up. "Sir, this man," Marcus interjected, his voice ringing with a quiet strength, "is an FBI agent. I've identified myself multiple times." Grayson's eyes flicked to the badge still in Marcus's hand. Recognition dawned on his face, followed by a deep, almost palpable regret. "Agent Bennett," he said, his tone shifting to one of respect. "I'm so sorry. I didn't realize you were in town." "Realize?" Marcus repeated, his voice heavy with irony. "Your officer here accused me of being a fraud." He drew his weapon. Grayson turned to Ethan, his expression darkening. "Is this true?" Ethan opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His face was a mask of defiance and panic. The air around them felt as heavy as the rain that continued to fall in thick sheets, drumming against the asphalt. Officer Ethan Caldwell stood frozen, his jaw clenched tightly as Detective Paul Grayson's question hung in the air like an uninvited guest. "Is this true, Ethan?" Grayson repeated, his voice lower now, with an edge that carried authority. Ethan's face flushed deep red, but he didn't answer. Instead, his eyes darted to Marcus, then to Rachel, whose phone was still pointed in their direction. the screen capturing every word, every movement. "Sir, Ethan finally stammered, but Grayson raised a hand to silence him. "Don't." Grayson snapped, his voice sharp. He turned to Marcus, his expression deeply apologetic, though his professionalism remained intact. "Agent Bennett, I'm truly sorry for this misunderstanding. I take full responsibility for—" "Don't apologize to me," Marcus interrupted, his tone calm but firm. "Apologize for the way your officer treated me. Apologize for the assumptions he made before I even said a word. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was something else entirely." Grayson flinched slightly, the weight of Marcus's words hitting him squarely. "You're right," he admitted after a long pause. "Ethan, hand over your badge and weapon." "Now, what?" Ethan's head jerked up, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Sir, you can't be serious." "I'm dead serious," Grayson replied coldly. "You've not only violated protocol, but you've disgraced this department. Hand them over." "This is ridiculous," Ethan hissed, though his hands moved reluctantly to unclip his badge and holster. He shoved them toward Grayson, his face twisting in anger. "You're throwing me under the bus because this guy—" "Careful," Marcus warned, his voice like steel. Ethan glared at him, but didn't finish the sentence. Grayson stepped between the two men, taking the badge and gun before turning back to Marcus. "Agent Bennett, I assure you, this incident will be addressed immediately. Ethan Caldwell is hereby suspended, effective immediately." Suspended. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. A suspension felt inadequate for what had just happened, for the humiliation and blatant prejudice he'd endured. But before he could respond, Rachel stepped closer. "Suspended?" she said, her voice dripping with incredulity. "You're suspending him?" "That's it." "Miss McCarthy," Grayson began, sighing as though he'd already anticipated her reaction. "This isn't a discussion for the middle of the street." "Then when is the discussion happening?" Rachel shot back, refusing to back down. "Because as far as I can see, the only reason this didn't escalate further is because Agent Bennett kept his composure. You're lucky no one got hurt tonight. How are you going to address that?" "Rachel," Marcus's voice was calm, but it carried enough weight to make her pause. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I appreciate your concern, but I'll handle this." Rachel hesitated, glancing between him and Grayson, before reluctantly nodding and lowering her phone. "Fine," she muttered, "but this isn't over." Grayson cleared his throat, shifting his focus back to Marcus. "If you're willing, I'd like you to come by the station tomorrow to file a formal complaint. We'll document everything." Marcus gave a short nod. "I'll be there." With that, Grayson gestured for Ethan to follow him back to the patrol car, but Ethan lingered, his eyes locked on Marcus with a venomous glare. "You think you're a hero?" he spat. "Walking around like you own the place." Grayson turned sharply. "Ethan, that's enough." Marcus didn't flinch. He stood tall, his expression calm and unwavering. "If standing up for myself makes me a hero in your eyes, maybe you should ask yourself why that bothers you so much." Ethan didn't respond. He simply turned and stormed off toward the patrol car, slamming the door behind him. Grayson gave Marcus one last apologetic look before following, leaving Marcus and Rachel standing alone in the rain. For a moment, there was only the sound of water splashing against the pavement and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. Then Rachel broke the silence. "You okay?" she asked, her tone softer now. Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face. "I've been through worse," he said, though his voice betrayed a weariness he couldn't quite hide. Rachel studied him for a moment, then gestured toward the small coffee shop down the street. "Come on," she said. "Let me buy you a coffee. Least I can do after all that." Marcus hesitated but ultimately nodded. All right. Inside the cafe, the warm light and faint smell of freshly brewed coffee provided a stark contrast to the cold, damp street outside. Marcus and Rachel took a seat in the corner, away from the few other customers scattered throughout the space. Rachel set her phone on the table, the screen dark now, but the recording still fresh in her mind. "So," she began, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup. "What happens next?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the steam rising from his own cup. "I'll file the complaint. From there, it's up to the department to decide how to handle it." "And you think they'll actually handle it?" Rachel asked, her tone skeptical. "I don't know," Marcus admitted, "but I've learned to pick my battles. Tonight was about getting out of that situation alive. Tomorrow is about accountability." Rachel nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I've lived here my whole life," she said after a moment. "I've seen guys like Ethan before. They don't just wake up one day and decide to be better. Someone has to force their hand." "Maybe," Marcus said, his voice quiet. "But it's not just about Ethan. This is bigger than him." Rachel tilted her head, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Marcus set his cup down and met her gaze. "Ethan didn't act the way he did because of some personal vendetta against me. He acted that way because he thought he could, because he thought no one would stop him. That's a systemic issue, not an individual one." Rachel leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued. "So, what are you going to do about it?" "I don't know yet," Marcus admitted, "but I'll start by making sure what happened tonight doesn't get swept under the rug." Rachel studied him, then smiled faintly. "You know, I think you're underestimating how much people will care about this story." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "And why's that?" "Because," Rachel said, tapping her phone, "people don't just care about the big picture. They care about the person standing in the middle of it. And tonight, that's you." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He simply sipped his coffee, his mind already turning over the events of the evening and the storm that was surely still to come. The following morning, the rain had eased to a light drizzle, but the storm brewing in Silver Creek was far from over. Marcus Bennett drove to the Silver Creek Police Department, his mind still replaying the events of the previous night. He wasn't a stranger to confrontations rooted in prejudice, but this one felt different, more public, more deliberate, and now it had the potential to ripple far beyond the confines of this quiet town. The small police station was buzzing with activity when Marcus stepped inside. Officers moved briskly through the narrow corridors, their conversations hushed but tense. As he approached the front desk, he noticed a few glances cast his way, some curious, others uncomfortable. "Agent Bennett," a voice called out. Marcus turned to see Detective Grayson, standing a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back and his expression professional but weary. "Detective," Marcus said with a polite nod. "Thank you for coming in," Grayson said, gesturing for Marcus to follow him. "Let's head to my office. I've already started drafting the report." The two men walked through the station, the hum of phones and chatter growing quieter as they reached Grayson's office. Inside, the room was modest but organized, with framed commendations lining the walls and a well-worn leather chair behind the desk. Grayson motioned for Marcus to sit, then closed the door behind him. "I won't waste your time," Grayson began, sitting down across from Marcus. "I've reviewed the footage from last night, and I've spoken to a few witnesses, including Miss McCarthy. There's no doubt in my mind that Officer Caldwell's actions were unjustifiable." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral. "Unjustifiable is putting it lightly." Grayson winced but nodded. "You're right. I've already initiated an internal investigation, and I've notified the district attorney's office. Caldwell will face disciplinary action, and depending on how things progress, there may be grounds for criminal charges." Marcus studied Grayson carefully. The man seemed genuine, but Marcus had seen too many instances where internal investigations amounted to little more than lip service. "What about the rest of your department?" he asked. "Do you honestly think Caldwell's attitude is an isolated case?" Grayson hesitated, his gaze dropping to the desk. "I won't lie to you, Agent Bennett. We're a small-town department, and we've had our share of problems. But I've spent years trying to root out the bad actors and change the culture here. Caldwell. He slipped through the cracks. Slipped through the cracks? Marcus echoed, his voice sharp. He didn't slip through anything, Detective. He was empowered by a system that allowed him to act without consequences. That doesn't happen in isolation. Grayson sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't disagree with you, but change takes time. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. And how much time do you think people like Caldwell should get? How many more incidents like last night are acceptable while you wait for change? Grayson didn't have an answer. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. A knock on the door interrupted the tension. Grayson called out, and an officer stepped inside, her expression cautious. Detective, Miss McCarthy is here. She says it's urgent. Grayson glanced at Marcus, then back at the officer. Send her in. Rachel McCarthy strode into the office, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Her usual fiery confidence was tempered by a hint of nervous energy. She barely waited for the door to close before speaking. The video's gone viral, she announced, looking directly at Marcus. Marcus's eyebrows lifted slightly, though his expression remained calm. How viral? Rachel handed him her phone, and he scrolled through the barrage of comments and shares. The video she'd taken the night before had spread across social media like wildfire, sparking outrage and heated debates. News outlets were already picking up the story, and hashtags like hashtag Silver Creek Incident and hashtag Justice for Marcus were trending. I told you people would care, Rachel said, a hint of satisfaction in her tone. This isn't just a local story anymore. It's national. Grayson rubbed his temples, clearly feeling the weight of the situation. This is going to bring a lot of scrutiny down on the department, he muttered. Good, Rachel shot back. Maybe that's exactly what you need. Marcus handed the phone back to her, his expression thoughtful. The attention is a double-edged sword, he said. It could push for accountability, but it also means this town and your department are going to be under a microscope. Grayson nodded grimly. I'll deal with it. My priority is making sure Caldwell is held accountable and that we prevent anything like this from happening again. Rachel crossed her arms. And how do you plan to do that? Before Grayson could answer, the door burst open and an officer rushed in, looking flustered. Detective, we've got a situation, he said. There's a group of protesters gathering outside the station. They're demanding answers. Grayson stood abruptly, his face tight with frustration. How many? Enough to block the front entrance, the officer replied. And it's growing. Marcus and Rachel exchanged a glance. Looks like the microscope's already here, Marcus said dryly. Grayson exhaled heavily, then turned to Marcus. Will you come with me? It might help if they hear from you directly. Marcus hesitated. He wasn't sure how he felt about being thrust into the spotlight like this, but he knew the stakes were bigger than his own discomfort. Finally, he nodded. Let's go. The crowd outside the station was a mix of locals and activists who had driven in from nearby towns after seeing the video. They held signs with slogans like Justice for Marcus and End Racial Profiling. The energy was electric, a mixture of anger and determination that seemed to ripple through the damp air. As Grayson and Marcus stepped outside, the crowd's murmurs turned into shouts. A woman at the front of the group called out, Is that him? Is that the agent? Marcus raised a hand, signaling for quiet. The crowd gradually fell silent, their eyes fixed on him. I appreciate you all being here, Marcus began, his voice steady and clear. I understand your anger. I share it. What happened last night was unacceptable, not just for me, but for anyone who has ever faced discrimination or abuse of power. But this isn't just about me. It's about holding systems accountable and ensuring this kind of behavior is no longer tolerated. The crowd erupted into applause and cheers, but Marcus held up his hand again. Change doesn't happen overnight, he continued. And it doesn't happen because of one man or one protest. It happens when we hold people accountable individually and systemically, and when we demand better from those in power. Rachel, standing off to the side, recorded the speech on her phone, her expression unreadable. Grayson stood nearby, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of tension and respect. As Marcus finished speaking, the crowd began chanting, "Justice, justice, justice." For a moment, Marcus allowed himself to feel the weight of their support. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. The real fight was still ahead. The atmosphere in Silver Creek was charged with a tension that refused to dissipate. Protests outside the police station swelled over the next few days, drawing people from neighboring towns and even larger cities. The incident involving Marcus had become a symbol, a rallying point for those who had long fought against systemic discrimination and abuse of power. Inside the station, however, the mood was markedly different. The small-town department struggled under the weight of the scrutiny. Officers shuffled through their shifts, glancing nervously at the protesters outside or at the growing stack of media inquiries piling up on the front desk. Morale was low, and Detective Grayson bore the brunt of it, juggling reporters, departmental oversight, and the fallout from Officer Caldwell's actions. Marcus, meanwhile, had opted to remain in Silver Creek longer than planned. He knew the FBI would eventually pull him back into active cases, but for now, his priority was ensuring the situation didn't get swept under the rug. He spent hours meeting with community leaders, activists, and even Rachel McCarthy, who had become something of a liaison between the protesters and the press. It was during one of these meetings, in a dimly lit church hall on the outskirts of town, that Marcus began to see the bigger picture. Around a folding table sat half a dozen local residents, each sharing their stories. "Caldwell isn't the first," said Maria Torres, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes. "He's just the first one to get caught on camera. My son," her voice cracked, and she paused to compose herself. "My son was pulled over 3 times last month for no reason, just for driving home from work." A young man named Darnell nodded in agreement. "Same here. They always say it's a broken taillight or some nonsense. But really, they just see a black guy in a nice car, and suddenly it's a problem." Rachel, seated across from Marcus, scribbled furiously in her notebook. Marcus listened intently, his hands clasped tightly together. The stories painted a bleak picture of a department that had allowed men like Caldwell to operate unchecked for years. "Why hasn't anyone spoken up before?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but probing. Maria sighed. "We've tried. Complaints get ignored, or worse, they get turned back on us. You speak up, and suddenly you're the one under investigation." The words hung in the air, and Marcus felt a familiar heaviness settle in his chest. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about a culture, a system that perpetuated this behavior while silencing those who dared to challenge it. At the same time, in a cramped apartment on the edge of town, Ethan Caldwell sat alone at his kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey his only companion. The past few days had been a blur of humiliation and mounting consequences. His suspension had been made public, and the video of his confrontation with Marcus had spread like wildfire. The name Ethan Caldwell had become synonymous with racism and abuse of power. He hadn't left his apartment since that night. Every knock at the door made him flinch. Every notification on his phone, another reminder of the growing outrage. News anchors dissected his actions on national television, and former colleagues avoided him like the plague. But beneath the shame, there was still a smoldering ember of anger. In his mind, he'd been doing his job, protecting his town. And now, everything he'd worked for was crumbling because of a single encounter. As the whiskey burned down his throat, Ethan's thoughts grew darker. He couldn't shake the image of Marcus standing tall, defiant, even as he'd held him at gunpoint. The way the man had refused to back down, to submit. It infuriated him. "They'll move on," Ethan muttered to himself, his voice slurred. "People always do. This'll blow over, and they'll forget." But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. Back at the station, Grayson called a meeting with Marcus, Rachel, and a few trusted officers to discuss the department's next steps. The internal investigation into Caldwell had progressed rapidly, thanks to the overwhelming evidence against him. But Grayson knew that wasn't enough. "We need to address the root of the problem," Grayson said, pacing the small conference room. "Caldwell's not the only one who's abused his power. There are others. Officers who've ignored protocols, harassed civilians, or turned a blind eye when they should have spoken up." Marcus leaned forward in his chair, his eyes sharp. "Then you need to clean house. Identify the problem officers and hold them accountable. Anything less is just damage control." Grayson nodded grimly. "I agree, but that's not going to fix the culture overnight. This department needs systemic change, training, oversight, partnerships with the community. It's going to take time, and it's going to be painful." Rachel spoke up, her voice firm. "It'll also take transparency. The community needs to see that you're serious about this. No more closed-door investigations or vague press releases. If you want their trust, you have earned it." The room fell silent as everyone considered her words. Grayson finally nodded. "You're right. I'll hold a press conference tomorrow. Lay everything out, the investigation, the steps we're taking, all of it." "And Caldwell?" Marcus asked. "The DA is reviewing the case," Grayson replied. "There's enough evidence to charge him with misconduct and possibly more." Marcus sat back, his expression unreadable. "Good. But don't stop there. If you really want to fix this, you need to keep going, no matter how uncomfortable it gets." Grayson met his gaze and nodded. "I will." That evening, as Marcus prepared to return to his hotel, Rachel caught up with him in the parking lot. "Hey!" she called out, jogging to his side. Marcus turned, raising an eyebrow. "What's up?" Rachel hesitated, then said, "I just wanted to say thanks for staying, for pushing for more than just a quick fix." Marcus gave her a small smile. "I'm just doing what needs to be done." "Yeah, well, not everyone would," Rachel replied. "A lot of people would have walked away once the spotlight was on someone else." Marcus shrugged. "Walking away doesn't change anything. Staying does." Rachel nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You're right, and for what it's worth, I think people are starting to notice. Not just here, but everywhere." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He glanced out at the quiet streets of Silver Creek, the faint sound of rain tapping against the pavement. "Let's hope it's enough," he said finally. As Rachel watched him walk away, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just a story. It was a turning point, and she was determined to see it through to the end. The days following the hearing in Silver Creek were a whirlwind of activity. Marcus's testimony had been aired nationwide, sparking heated debates in living rooms, newsrooms, and city halls across the country. The small, unassuming town had become the epicenter of a broader conversation about systemic racism in law enforcement. For the first time in years, Silver Creek wasn't just another dot on the map. It was a symbol of change. But for Marcus, the aftermath wasn't just about the national attention. It was about the personal connections he had made, the quiet moments of introspection, and the determination to ensure that what had started here would have lasting impact. 2 weeks after the hearing, Marcus stood outside the courthouse again, this time in the crisp morning air. The crowd that had gathered was smaller now, but no less passionate. Among them were community members, activists, and a few familiar faces, including Rachel McCarthy, camera in hand, ready to document the next chapter of Silver Creek's story. Detective Grayson approached Marcus with a cautious smile. "You made an impression," he said, extending his hand. Marcus shook it, his grip firm. "Let's hope it lasts." "It will," Grayson said, his voice laced with conviction. "Caldwell has officially been dismissed from the department, and the DA's office is moving forward with charges for misconduct and false reporting." "That's a start," Marcus replied, his expression measured. "But what about the department as a whole? What are you doing to make sure this doesn't happen again?" Grayson hesitated, then nodded. "We've brought in an independent oversight committee. They'll be conducting a full review of our policies and practices. It's not just about punishment anymore. It's about reform. Marcus studied him for a moment, then gave a curt nod. Good. Accountability is one thing. Prevention is another. Later that afternoon, Marcus met Rachel at the small cafe where they had first sat down together weeks ago. The place was quieter now, the bustle of reporters and onlookers having faded. "You've been busy," Marcus said as he slid into the seat across from her. Rachel grinned, tapping her phone. "You have no idea. The story's gotten bigger than I ever expected. People want to know what happens next. They're invested. And you?" Marcus asked, raising an eyebrow. "What happens next for you?" Rachel's smile faded slightly, replaced by a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking about that," she admitted. "I started out wanting to tell the story of what happened to you. But now, I think there's a bigger story to tell. About this town, about the people who live here, about how we can move forward." Marcus nodded slowly. "That's a story worth telling." Rachel leaned forward, her eyes bright with determination. "What about you? Are you heading back to Sacramento?" "For now," Marcus said. "But this isn't the kind of thing you walk away from. I'll be watching, and I'll be ready to step in if things start slipping." "Good," Rachel said with a small smile. "Because I think Silver Creek is going to need people like you, and not just from the outside." Marcus tilted his head, intrigued. "What are you getting at?" Rachel hesitated, then shrugged. "Maybe you're not done with this town yet. Maybe this town isn't done with you." In the weeks that followed, Silver Creek began to change. The Oversight Committee brought in new training programs and stricter policies for accountability. Officers were required to undergo bias training, and community members were invited to participate in discussions about policing practices. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't fast, but it was progress. As for Marcus, he returned to his work with the FBI, but the impact of Silver Creek stayed with him. He became a more vocal advocate for systemic change, speaking at conferences and participating in panels on racial equity in law enforcement. His story, while deeply personal, became a catalyst for something much larger. Rachel continued her work as a journalist, documenting the changes in Silver Creek and beyond. Her articles gained national recognition, shining a light on the town's efforts to rebuild trust and accountability. And though she and Marcus didn't speak often, they remained connected. Two people brought together by a moment of injustice, bound by a shared commitment to making things right. 1 year later, Marcus found himself back in Silver Creek, standing in the same spot where the confrontation with Ethan Caldwell had taken place. The street was quieter now, the rain long gone. A small group of children played in a nearby park, their laughter carried on the breeze. As he stood there, reflecting on everything that had happened, a voice broke through his thoughts. "Agent Bennett?" He turned to see a young black boy, no older than 10, looking up at him with wide, curious eyes. Behind him, a woman, presumably his mother, watched cautiously. "Yes," Marcus said, crouching slightly to meet the boy's gaze. "My mom said you're a hero," the boy said, his voice shy but sincere. Marcus smiled faintly, shaking his head. "I'm not a hero. I'm just someone trying to do the right thing." The boy considered this for a moment, then nodded. "I want to do the right thing too." Marcus straightened, his heart swelling with a mix of hope and determination. "Then you're already on the right path," he said. As the boy and his mother walked away, Marcus felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, he truly believed that change was possible. Not just in Silver Creek, but everywhere. And as he turned to leave, he carried that belief with him, ready to face whatever came next.